Welcome to another episode of the Loadout Music Podcast, featuring in-depth interviews with a wide range of music personalities, from rock and roll Hall of Famers to Grammy winners and today's rising stars. Recorded from the Old Rock House in St. Louis, Missouri, here's your host, Aaron Perlut.
Welcome back to the Loadout Music Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Aaron Perlut, coming to you from our partner, the Old Rock House music venue here in St. Louis. You know, in the 1990s, our next guest, along with his buddies, including Adam Levine, dreamt of making it big in music like a lot of us do. Then they ultimately became Maroon 5, and it really happened, emerging as one of the biggest bands on the planet. But a funny thing happened along the way to Ryan Dusick, Maroon 5's founding drummer. He ran into problems with anxiety and alcoholism and more, and ultimately left the band. He now works as a marriage and family therapist and outlines his long and winding journey in the new memoir, Harder to Breathe. We welcome Ryan Dusick to the show. Ryan, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me on, Aaron.
So, you know, I tend to like to go back to the very beginning with our guests, and you know, you all the guys that ultimately became Maroon 5, you guys went to high school together, right? You grew up together, you're buddies when you were kids.
Yeah, Adam and I actually knew each other when we were little kids. We had a mutual family friend, and so I mean, I wasn't close with him, but I knew him. We had actually, I think, even gone on a family trip together once, and he was a couple grades below me, so he just seemed like an annoying little kid to me at the time. But then, you know, when we got to high school, we were more on the same page, and we were really into the same kind of music, and I recognized that he had some talent. So we became close friends at that point when I was about 16. And we started the band, in 1994. He had met Jesse and Mickey in middle school, and I had been playing with other bands before that as well. And so when I was looking to start my own band, and Adam was the guy I wanted to start it with, he introduced me to Jesse and Mickey, and we all were at Brentwood High School at the time together. And it really was just kind of this coming of age story where we started a band together as teenagers and really found ourselves and found our sound over a period of time that was an evolution together, both creatively and as just friends in a relationship. So yeah, I mean, it was really just kind of an innocent time, and that led later to what became Maroon 5.
And you guys were originally called Kara's Flowers, correct?
Kara's Flowers, but
Flowers.
yeah, a lot of people mispronounced the name, and that's part of the reason why we ended up changing it.
What Kara's Flowers, that was when you were still in high school?
Yeah, well, we started the band when I was in 11th grade. The other guys were freshmen, and we named the band Kara's Flowers at that time. We actually got a record deal right out of high school, or they were still in high school, and made our first major label record on Reprise Warner Brothers in 97 when I was like 19, you know. And they finished high school, and we hit the road for the first time to promote the album that was the Kara's Flowers album, The Fourth World. And we spent about 6 months on the road at that time, and we thought we were going to be the next Pearl Jam or whoever was big at the time, and it didn't work out that way. You know, we just we had stars in our eyes, and the record came out and fizzled, and it was a big disappointment. So we kind of had to go back to the drawing board at that point and figure out who we were as a band and if we were going to keep going.
So what were those conversations like when you're trying to soul search collectively and figure out who we're going to be?
It was tough. We kind of went through a collective identity crisis at that point. We went in a lot of different directions stylistically. I mean, every month or every show, every demo that we made, it sounded like a different band. And I think if you asked each of the four members, you know, what kind of band we were, at that point, you would get four different answers. And so it really, after the disappointment of that first record where we felt very focused on what we were doing, it was tough, and we were pulling in a lot of different directions, and it wasn't clear if we were going to end up back on the same page. We took a little hiatus for a little while, I think about 6 months, Adam and Jesse went to New York and did a semester at a music school out there. And Mickey and I were at UCLA, and I was studying English. Mickey was studying theater. And weirdly enough, when Adam and Jesse came back from New York, we were all listening to the same kind of music again, and we were all kind of inspired and reconnected in ways that we hadn't been in a couple of years. So it really was. It felt like I don't know, fate or just a sort of rejuvenated moment in our passion for what we were doing, and it led to this second wave or this renaissance in the band that was really inspiring and helped us find our new sound and what would become Maroon 5.
I would imagine that. I mean, I think of myself at 19 years old, and my maturity now at 51 is not much greater than that. But I would imagine, thinking about some of the challenges you write on in this book, that being on the road, essentially being unsupervised, because you're an adult and you're living the rock and roll lifestyle, going to clubs. That must have been was that kind of a start down a slippery slope for you?
No, you would think that's the classic tale, right?
Yeah.
Of the kid that gets out on the road and lives the rock and roll life, and then the demons come. When we first did that, we were really innocent kids. When I was 19 on the road for the first time, I was such a good little boy. Like, I didn't get into any trouble. I was what you would call straight edge at that time. I wasn't drinking or smoking or anything. I was the oldest guy in the band too, and the most responsible. I was the guy who had always been the one that booked our shows and did our mailing list and drove us around. Made sure that everyone showed up washed. I was the adult in the group, to a point that was probably a little obnoxious. I think the other guys thought I was a little bit anal, a little stuck up, which was probably true. I think that I allowed myself to let my hair down more a couple years later when I was in my 20s. So that first time on tour, if anything, I look at it as I had a stick up my butt. Like, I was out on the road and I was homesick, and I missed my family. I missed my girlfriend back home. I loved being with the guys and I loved playing and everything, but it wasn't what you would imagine in terms of, like, the crazy rock and roll life at that point. But fast forward 5 years from then, when we were doing the next record and we were out on tour as Maroon 5, it was a little different at that point. We were still good boys in terms of, we were not wild and crazy. We were raised well. We were relatively well-mannered. But it was a different thing at that point. I was definitely drinking more, and there definitely was a more of an attitude of, I want to live this up a bit. I think both because we knew we were going to be on the road for a long time. That was kind of the plan at that point with our record label, was it's going to be a long haul. We're going to build this record the old fashioned way. I'm going to get on the road for at least a year. We're going to just go radio station to radio station, try to build this record up organically, build word of mouth. And so I just felt like, I know this is going to be a long haul. I know that this lifestyle is a little crazy. I just want to kind of lean into it and have as much fun as I can. If we're in a college town and we're playing, a party, I want to hang out and I want to soak up the local flavor. That was kind of my attitude, and it worked for a while. For a couple of years there, we were having fun, and it was a good energy, and it wasn't over the top crazy rock and roll lifestyle kind of thing, but it was a lot. I mean, our lives were just hectic. I mean, it was one tour into the next, and it was like we were in a radio station in the morning doing an acoustic performance, and then that afternoon we were in a record store doing an in-store signing, and then that evening we were playing a show, and then the local reps wanted to take us out and we'd go drinking. And so it was like never ending and thrilling, but also exhausting. So that's when it did start to take its toll on me.
So you guys put out songs about Jane in, I think, like 2002. And when does the trajectory, when do you start seeing that trajectory for the band? Like, oh, this shit's kind of real. Like, something's happening here.
It was gradual,
Yeah.
it's funny because we won the Grammy for Best New Artist in 2005, I guess. And we were a band for 11 years at that point.
Yeah.
And the album had been out for 2.5 years, 3 years, no, 3 years. Yeah. Um, 3.5 years, whatever it was. We went on tour in like January or February of 2002. The record came out that summer. We were already 6 months into touring when it came out. The first single, Hard to Breathe, we worked at radio for a year before it peaked. And so it was very gradual. Like everything we were doing felt natural. It felt like the next stage. Like we would play a club tour, and that was cool. And then we'd come back, and then we did a theater tour, and then you know what I mean. Like so, it wasn't like one day all of a sudden it was everything changed. But then in 2004, at the start of 2004, when we released This Love as a single, that was kind of the crossover hit that went to pop radio and came out internationally. And the video was just like in heavy rotation on MTV and VH1. And at that moment, it's when we kind of realized, okay, holy shit, like this is another level. For the first time, I think in that year when we were on tour, we'd go sightseeing and we had to leave because Adam would get swarmed, because people recognized him from the videos. And just even going to the mall or going to the movies, it's like our song was on in the background everywhere you went. It was just omnipresent. So in 2004 it was when it was a noticeable jump in terms of the ubiquitous nature of Maroon 5.
So in the book you discuss a lot of these challenges, both physical and psychological, and obviously with the kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle, alcohol being omnipresent. At what point do you start to feel unsteady?
Well, it was, I had physical issues on the road first.
Yeah.
As a drummer, I had never really learned proper technique. I was self-taught. And I had an I had an old pitching injury. I was a baseball player in high school, kind of threw out my arm at that time. And that injury just kind of came back up and started nagging at first. That was the first sign I had that I was wearing down a bit.
How old are you? How old are you at this point when you start to feel the physical wear and tear of the road and just playing every night or multiple times a day, depending on how many publicity stops you're doing?
The first time I started to have that problem was in 2003 when we were about a year and a half into touring on that album. And I went home for a week in the middle of our first headlining tour to try to figure out what was wrong with my arm and how to fix it. And I had an orthopedist tell me that it was just chronic tendonitis in my rotator cuff and a lot of inflammation in there, and I just needed to rest for a bit and do some physical therapy and stuff. And I did all of that, and I got cortisone shots in my shoulder. But in retrospect, I can recognize now that there was a lot more going on than just that. And even then, I had a sense that there was. I couldn't really verbalize it. But my psychology was just, I was really losing confidence fast. I had imposter syndrome in terms of like, I don't really belong here because I never really learned how to play the drums, and then you have these physical limitations, and I felt like there was something defective. I felt like there was something to my core that just couldn't hack it, and that it was just a matter of time before my body and my whole constitution would really give out on me. And so that was the kind of the undercurrent, and there was this foreboding, this sense of doom in my mind that this was all going to end really badly for me. And I don't know if that was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy or it was a chicken or the egg kind of thing, in terms of what came first and where it got to. But my ability to perform just started suffering more and more. I started having nerve issues. My coordination got worse. And then I really had to take time off from performing. And that's when the self-medication ramped up, because up until that point, alcohol had always been a way to facilitate the good times. It was uh, just having fun with my buddies and a way to have even more fun, right? But then all of a sudden you're in pain, physically and emotionally and psychologically, and feeling broken and feeling beaten down, and just you know my self-esteem was really getting really low. And so for the first time at that point, drinking became an escape, or a way to put on a mask, to numb the pain, or to put on a sort of alter ego of sorts that was just enjoying all of this, the Jekyll and Hyde kind of thing. Like this, the real guy was suffering, and then I would, have a few drinks, and this other guy would show up who was having a great time, and it was just a party. So that's where the double nature and the insidious nature of the self-medication and what became addiction started. And it went through all the cycles that you are, I'm sure, aware of in terms of alcoholism and addiction. And when it was self-medication, and then I thought I had it under control, but I really didn't. So all that.
So the self-doubt you were starting to feel as you guys are growing, you're becoming bigger, your arm is, there's something wrong physically. Was that the anxiety kind of taking hold of you and kind of just pulling you down? And then the alcohol ultimately was kind of the remedy for not only the physical pain, but for the but for the, the psychosis of the anxiety that was just kind of eating you up inside?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of different factors all at once that contributed to the breakdown that I had, really.
Yeah.
I mean, nervous breakdown is not a clinical term, but it really is a phrase that kind of encapsulates what happened to me, because it was my level of exhaustion. It was physical, it was mental, and it basically essentially led to my nervous system not functioning the way that it used to in terms of performance. And I look at it now as a dystonia, which is a term I didn't have at that time. I only learned recently. Musicians' dystonia is basically when you've been doing something a million times, and all of a sudden it becomes very difficult because your body has gone through a trauma of having to perform under grueling circumstances for an extended period of time, and it basically decides you can't do this anymore. You're killing yourself. And says, no, we're not going to allow you to do this anymore. And so my body was just not allowing me to perform playing the drums the way that it had. And it became a coordination issue. It was a nerve issue. So really my nervous system breaking down, and the anxiety factors into it, because I put so much pressure on myself. Half of the stress that I was under was self-imposed, right? It was worrying, and it was holding myself to unrealistic standards, and this imposter syndrome, and beating myself down, and this foreboding of something bad's going to happen. That put a lot of stress and strain on my mind and my constitution. And the alcohol became a problem. It wasn't what led to that breakdown, but it was part of what I think made it hard for me to come out of it. Because once I was in a hole, and then I didn't really know what to do with it. And I couldn't even get a sort of definitive answer as to what the problem was. And so it felt more to the core of me than any of these doctors were telling me. My only real coping mechanism was to try to pretend like it wasn't happening, to try to escape and feel something else. And so that worked for the moment in terms of just like avoiding the issue, but it actually made the issue worse, because it was taking more of a toll on my nervous system, and I wasn't addressing what was going on. I was just burrowing deeper into this dark place, and it took me a long time to come out of it. Once I left the band, I was just in a hole for a while that I didn't really find closure on for really a decade.
Was a lot of pop musicians don't get recognized for musicianship, but Maroon 5 has always been seen as a collective group of very good musicians. knowing that, was that part of the imposter syndrome piece, that you knew these guys around you were excellent musicians, and it's kind of a rat race to keep up, and did that drive any of it, or do you think what you were going through was just typical for maybe any young musician?
Well, that's nice to hear. I did feel that musicians thought that we were a musicians band at that time. Um, and but it's nice to hear. I think that for me, I think the imposter syndrome kicked in, not because of the other guys, because we were a garage band when we started, and we were all somewhat self-taught. I mean, everyone was on their own journey. Jesse at a certain point was studying theory and studying composition and jazz and classical music, and his understanding of music definitely ramped up as the band progressed and evolved. Adam is just like a savant. Like, he just has
Sure.
a natural knack for melody and groove, and he did get better and better as a musician over time, and certainly as a performer. But a lot of it was just really raw, natural talent for him. And for me, I got really good really fast just doing an impression of the drummers that I loved. And because I was an athletic guy, I could coordinate it without really taking lessons or studying music. And for the longest time as a band, I never really thought that was an issue. And as a band, we kind of took pride in the fact that we were this scrappy garage band doing a great impression of great musicianship. And all of a sudden we were playing, I think, really great arrangements and doing it really well. And James, being the fifth member, who was a trained jazz guitarist, he kind of classed up the joint a bit. He was another level of musicianship. He came in and really laid it down smoothly, and it made us all better. What it changed for me was when we were on the road. The first time we went on the road in '97 as Cars Flowers, it was all kind of punk ska bands that we were playing with. So it felt consistent with our self identity as these garage rockers. But now we're in the pop world in 2003, 4, and we're touring with massive artists who have studio musicians who are some of the highest class, highest paid musicians in the world, who are like Juilliard trained or Berklee School of Music trained. And I'm going out there night after night and watching these people who, this is no joke, like, these aren't guys that just like somehow had some natural talent and just stumbled onto this stage. Like, they're there for a reason. They are at the highest caliber musician. And I just like it was hard not to compare myself to that. And I knew we had a cool chemistry together, and that what we were doing was unique, and that we made a good racket together. But I still kind of saw us as these garage rockers who were doing an impression of pop and R&B, when these other guys were really doing it professionally. So it was impossible for me to not feel like I was not really up to snuff, and that some of the ways in which I hadn't really learned might come back to haunt me.
So going back to the timeline you were laying out before, so you're kind of back home recovering, you start self-medicating. What's the point where, and you had talked about having a breakdown, at what juncture does this breakdown actually happen, where you're like, this has to stop for me, I got to make a change?
Well, again, it was gradual. It's hard to pinpoint a moment. I know that on our first headlining tour in 2003 was the first time that I had these really these visions of doom. Just as I say in my book, Harder to Breathe, there's a chapter called Cracks in the Ceiling. It was just like this image in my mind of like the roof above me was cracking, and it's just a matter of time before it all kind of caves in, and I'm just buried beneath everything, all these things I was trying to keep in the air at once, while I was more and more sort of breaking down. In 2004, when it was international and we were touring overseas, and the jet lag really became an issue, because sleep was also an issue for me, and the exhaustion level. That's when it really became a breakdown, to the point where I was like, I literally can't keep this up. And it was, I mean, I would have played until my arms fell off, because I was just stubborn and in denial. but the other guys were like, there's obviously clearly something wrong. You need to go home and figure out what's going on for you. And so that was the moment in which it started out as just taking another break and trying to get myself together, but the break just didn't lead to anything productive. I went to every kind of doctor you can go to, and they all had some answer to give me. I mean, the orthopedist told me I had inflammation in the shoulder, gave me cortisone, prescribed physical therapy, and rest. The neurologist said I had slowing of the nerves in my right arm and called it thoracic outlet syndrome. And same thing, physical therapy and shots and medicines and whatnot and rest. And that dragged on, and the coordination was not improving. And now I'm going to like 8 different doctors. I'm on like 8 different medications. And if anything, it got worse. Like my coordination got worse. I was on like central nervous system depressants and over medicated, I think, as well as now self medicating for the first time. The alcoholism wasn't to the degree yet that it became after I left the band. But I certainly shouldn't have been drinking at that point at all, really. But I got a lot of bad advice. I think they were giving me medication that wasn't helping. I even had a doctor, and I won't say any names, who said to me, "Oh, you just need to relax. Just have a few cocktails and kick back, and you'll be all right." And so I took that advice very literally. I was like, "Oh, I just need to relax and have a few drinks," and that's what the doctor ordered. Didn't help. My nerves got worse. My mental health suffered as a result. And there I was, just kind of like sitting in my apartment at home, watching my band from afar now, out on the road, conquering the world, while I was, just feeling sorry for myself and feeling over medicated and wounded. So that was when the breakdown was really happening. I would go out with the band for stretches at that point, just to be with them on tour and sing my background vocals from the soundboard or from the monitor board, and just to try to be connected to what was happening. But it was, again, that Jekyll and Hyde thing, putting on this mask that I was having fun and enjoying the rock star life with them, but then going back to my hotel room and just falling apart and being really a wreck. And then when I left the band, that's when I really kind of fell off a cliff there, in terms of like all of my sense of identity and purpose that had been wrapped up in being in that band was gone. And all that was left was just trying to fill the void. And I didn't have any reason to hold on to hope anymore. So it became I became very nihilistic, I think, in my first couple of years after I left the band.
At what point did you finally leave? What was did you make it to, because I think it was 2007 where It Won't Be Soon Before Long was dropped. Was it before or after that? Did you make it through another record? If so, I mean, I would think it'd be very hard for you to perform in the studio.
Yeah, well, in 2005 we started talking about making another record, and we had already been writing songs. Like there were several songs that ended up on the next record that we had been playing either in soundcheck or in shows on the road when I was performing, like Makes Me Wonder and Wasted Years and a few other songs. Won't Go Home Without You. And we were now in the studio trying to record demos and stuff in 2005 or 6. And the plan was for me to come back and start performing and playing on the record. And the band wanted that to happen, but I think they knew it wasn't going to happen because things were not improving. This is how the book that I'm putting out, Harder to Breathe, starts. Is this moment when we're at the Houdini Mansion in Laurel Canyon, which is this great old house where Rick Rubin turned it into a recording studio. Yeah. The Chili Peppers record their albums there, and we were inspired by that. And this beautiful old rundown estate, and should be the moment, and the highest moment of my life, recording the follow-up to our multi-platinum debut, and very glamorous and exciting. And instead we're having a conversation about how I'm not going to be able to hack it. And even if I could get through the record, like the concern was then we're going to have a world tour booked, and you're going to go out on tour, and then the same thing's going to happen, and we're going to be scrambling in terms of how to move forward. So that was the moment in 2006 when I officially left the band. However, they did ask me to stay on in a production capacity to work on the record because I was already invested in it. You know, it was tough because I think that they, to a certain extent, the band and management wanted to do that because they felt they owed it to me. But it was an uncomfortable situation for everyone because I was in a dark place. I was angry and frustrated with myself, but kind of projecting that, with, in psychology, we call it displacement, displaced anger, misdirected anger at the guys in the band. And I was just a wreck, it was, and they were trying to make the most important album of their life, the follow-up sophomore album, and trying to deal with me being there and being a part of it. It was just a really complicated place to be. So I was there, but I wasn't, and I was involved to an extent, and I wasn't to an extent. So that next record is definitely something that looms in my mind as a sore spot, I suppose, because of that. But yeah, by the time that record came out, I was out of the band.
Yeah. And so you said that after you left the band, you dove deeper into alcohol because you had indicated before you got into a very, much darker place. And I would imagine, that's when the bitterness kind of creeps up on you and you're looking at what's happening with the band, because at that point, they are at that point becoming the biggest band in the world. And I imagine that has to really be draining for you on a lot of different levels.
Yeah, it was very complicated for me psychologically. My self-esteem had already been going down, in the years before, but then at that point, my identity had been sort of taken away from me, and my self-confidence was just gone. And then that would be hard enough, right? Something that was so much of your self-definition is now gone, and like my whole social world was wrapped up in it, and my creative self, my spiritual self, everything was wrapped up in it. That would be enough, to go through a feeling of grief and loss of what had been and what was now gone. But on top of that, what was now gone was also the biggest band in the world. Right? So that'll mess with your head, where it's like, okay, I could be there too, but I wasn't good enough, or I was a failure. So it was a double whammy for me, watching them and being proud of what we had spent a decade building, and feeling very wrapped up in that, and enjoying the success of it. But then at the same time, just really beating myself down, thinking, why them and not me? So it was hard. And I the first couple of years there, I really was in a bad place. And I think that, alcoholism is insidious though, because it was clear to everyone that I was struggling. But then, enough time passed that I felt like I kind of was ready to move on with my life. And I convinced myself that I had control over it, that it was just a matter of moderation, and it was a matter of kind of moving on and figuring out ways to drink like a gentleman, and to just kind of be a more grown-up version of myself. And that kind of worked for a minute. I think I was able to show up to events and to family functions looking like I had my shit together, and pretending that I was happy and healthy. But really, this was just another mask, right? Another alter ego of the guy who's like, oh yeah, that's all in my past, and now I'm just a happy guy who likes to have fun and happy-go-lucky. And I maintained that for a few years, but then it catches up with you. It's insidious, and it becomes a problem when you think you have it under control. And so it had to get back to a place that was really humbling. A few years down the road, when I realized I really didn't have control, and that the path that I was on was just going to continue to lead me into a darker and darker place. My anxiety got worse and worse. I was having panic attacks on a daily basis, and really just struggling. And at the end of my drinking to the point where, it sounds cliche, but I was just sick and tired of feeling sick and tired, and wanted to, not just wanted to, knew deep down with some kind of weird moment of clarity that if I kept going in that direction, it would keep getting worse till I died. And the only remedy for that was to start walking 1 foot at a time, in the other direction. And that's when my whole life really changed. Then I started this new journey of recovery that has me here, promoting a book about it, and working as a therapist and a mental health advocate, spreading a message of hope for people that are struggling, and hopefully can see themselves in my journey.
Yeah, you lost about, I mean, essentially a decade of your life. You kind of lost to these struggles you were having, and I certainly can relate to what you were saying earlier about the whole idea of drinking like a gentleman, or at least trying to achieve that. Which, by the way, "Drink Like a Gentleman" sounds like a great song or song title. But in that, with my struggles with alcohol, I tried different ways. I'll only have 3 drinks and then I'm done. And then you realize, yeah, some people can moderate and some people just cannot. And if you cannot, for me at least, I can't have alcohol as part of my life because I'm not capable of moderating, and it becomes a slippery slope. And then next thing you know, you're a 6-pack in, then you have a couple more bourbons, and then maybe you split a glass of wine, a bottle of wine with your wife to finish off the night for yourself over dinner. So it's so what is, as you're kind of getting towards the tail end of this decade of loss for you, what's the point where the light goes on that helps you pull yourself out, or what helps pull you out? What is it that does that for you?
Well, I had to be really humbled. There's this age-old debate with people in recovery, like, do you need to hit a rock bottom, in order to find sobriety? I, for one, I don't really know the answer to that question. I don't believe, I think to my core, that you have to hit a rock bottom, but I do think you have to be humbled. I think you have to be in a place where you recognize my way is not working. My way is just making it worse. Everything, all these illusions that I've held in my mind of control over this thing are exactly that, an illusion. And I think it was that moment of recognizing that was the turning point. And I'm very lucky to have had support, having people that were in my corner that were able to finally really kind of, just point me in the direction I needed to go. And for me to be humbled enough to embrace that and accept that help. And I went into rehab 2 different times. The first time it didn't stick. It was kind of just like me dipping my toes in the water. And it was a good experience, but I was still wrapped up in my sort of denial and rationalizations. And that just shows you I wasn't there yet. I wasn't at that place of humility to be ready to start a journey of recovery. The second time I was there. I was truly just like at a place where spiritually I felt just totally broken, and very thankfully it wasn't the kind of bottom where I was on the street and homeless or lost everything, or my family had turned their back on me. Those kind of horrible things that can happen to people when they chase that dragon all the way to that end. For me, it was just realizing that I was miserable, and that I was disconnected from life, and that I didn't want it to be that way anymore. I wanted to live again. And early on in that journey, when I went into the Betty Ford Center out in the desert here in Southern California, even just a couple weeks in, even just getting past like the detox, and still like just a big bundle of nerves, and terrified, and not knowing what I was doing, something struck me about how there were people that were just a couple weeks longer sober than me that seemed to have something figured out that I didn't have figured out yet. And I was just kind of following their lead. And then also recognizing that the people that were coming in behind me, that were just a couple weeks behind me in terms of sobriety, I had something to offer them. They could see even me, just having been sober for 2 weeks, having some level of something I'd gained in the process that they wanted, and that I was able to be helpful just by being there with them, and giving them encouragement. Something as simple as just walking a guy who's shaking like a leaf to his room and helping him with his bags and acclimating him to the process of the program, it infected me with this feeling of I had something to offer another human being in a helpful way that I hadn't had in a long time. And that was a powerful uh, spiritual sort of awakening for me, in that being of service, I was so wrapped up in my own crap for so long that I didn't realize that being there for another human being is a really effective way to get out of that self-obsession and to feel that you have something to offer. And so finding that purpose and finding that fulfilling, the process of doing that was like a new passion for me very early on in recovery. And I've just kind of followed that path every step of the way. I volunteered at a recovery center for a couple of years doing that. And that led me back to school to become a therapist. And so everything that I'm doing now is really an outgrowth of that spirit, that thing that woke up in me and found that fulfillment and purpose in just being of service to another human being.
Do you think that what you ultimately found was, just reading through the lines of what you're saying, when you were coming up with your, which were your buddies that ultimately became your band, you had a sense of community within that band. And it sounds like what you were talking about, what you found in recovery, became a new sense of community for you, where you were learning from some and others were learning from you. And there was that connectivity that you had made through music and that the interpersonal relationships with Adam and the other guys, and you were rediscovering a new way for that to manifest itself in your life.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. Because for me, I had to discover what my self-definition for spirituality was. And that's exactly what it is. It's about connection, that connectivity you described. I didn't realize how important that was in my life with the band. I knew it was something that I enjoyed, but that was like, it was a spiritual experience, being connected to other human beings in a meaningful way and feeding off of each other. We were growing together as musicians and as people growing up from, teenagers to young men. That was a big part of what gave my life meaning and purpose, and that connection. And so I was craving that and realizing in early recovery that is, essential to your spiritual health, is finding connection to something outside of self, because we get so mired in our own struggles and they become all consuming when we don't have things that are outside of ourselves that we're connected to. And it could be different for different people. That's that for the first time I understood the power of organized religion, of the reasons why people need some structure and some community that they can lean on, a fellowship and something that gives them connection. So in recovery, it can be the 12 steps. That's why that element of the 12 steps is so powerful. People getting in a room together and sharing what they've learned with the newcomers. It gives both of them strength and meaning, because the newcomer is learning from the person who already has gained something, and the person who's already gained something is gaining even more by giving it back to someone new. So there is this powerful force that happens when you have that connection and you have that purpose. And it was very tangible. It wasn't something I always thought spirituality had to be this cosmic ethereal thing. It was very tangible. It was like, here are other people that I'm connected to in a meaningful way, and it feels good, and I want more of that. And so I just followed that feeling.
And of course, today you're working at the Missing Peace Center for Anxiety in Agora Hills. And the new book, of course, Adam Levine actually writes the foreword to it. What are you hoping that people learn and take away from, reading Harder to Breathe? What do you want people to gain from it? What mission are you on by publishing this?
Well, I thought about writing this book probably 5 or 10 years before I did, because I knew I had a unique story and I thought it would make a good book. But at that time, I didn't know what the purpose was. And I was still in the middle of my suffering and drinking, and it would have been a very different book, right? But writing the book when I was in grad school studying psychology, I realized I had a purpose for the book. It was because it had a happy ending now. It had something to look forward to that was hopeful and inspiring. So my intent in writing it and writing it the way that I did was, I want to portray my journey in the most honest and vulnerable way that I can, because that's the way that hopefully people can see their own struggles in mine. People can relate to what I went through, not because they necessarily had experiences that were the same as mine, because not very many people get to, live the things that we did in the band, but because my struggles are very common, insecurities, sensitivities, anxieties, depression, perfectionism, obsessive compulsiveness, and of course the alcoholism that came. All of these things are very relatable to a much larger audience, hopefully, than just musicians that have been in a pop band. So my intent in writing it the way that I did, being very vulnerable, is that anyone can relate to it. And if you see yourselves in my struggle, then hopefully you can see yourselves in my recovery and in what I've found in recovery, which is purpose and fulfillment and a whole new path in life that is just something positive and really meaningful to me. And if I can get there, then if you're in a similar place, you can get there too. That's essentially what it is.
All right, I have to ask you this last question. If the guys ever came back to you and said, dude, you got it, would you ever go back to music? Ever? Is it a possibility?
That's a complicated question. I would love to say absolutely yes. And if it were realistic, if it were something I felt that I could handle and that I could do it, then I would say yes. But if I couldn't, then I would probably have to say no. In some ways, what I'm doing now is equally, if not more, fulfilling than being in a successful band. I'm 45 now, and I think that when you hit middle age, your priorities are they shift a little bit, at least for me. I don't know. I feel that that giving back and leaving an imprint on this world, not that, making great music isn't leaving an imprint on the world. I felt very fulfilled in doing that, but just on the level of actually helping people, it's something I wouldn't give up. I want to do what I'm doing. In terms of music, it's always going to be a part of my soul. And I love that experience. I would love to just go out with them for a couple of months and hang out on the bus and have fun and be silly like we were when we were teenagers. I would agree to do that just for the fun of it. But there's a lot that's wrapped up with music that's complicated for me, and performance and all of that. So it would have to be the right circumstances, and it would have to feel like it was a healthy, really wonderful thing for me at that moment in my life for me to do it.
Are you with the arm and shoulder? Are you physically capable of playing drums anymore? To the level that you of expectation you may have for yourself?
That's another complicated question and answer. The short answer is no, not right now. I don't think that I am capable. But the more complicated answer is that physically, I probably am actually capable. I don't think I have any injuries that actually prevent me from being able to do it. It's more the trauma that's built into the past and my body, this dystonia that I describe in terms of my body just not wanting to do it. There's a lot of muscle memory that's all out of whack. There's a lot of baggage that I carry when I sit at the drum set, which isn't there anywhere else in my life. I've worked through my issues and I feel very comfortable in my own skin in most settings, but that was the site of my trauma, right? It's like going back to a war zone, to sit behind the drums and try to do something that was so painful for me. So so I think physically I'm capable of it if I could get myself to the place where I'm psychologically capable of it. But that's a challenge. It's in some ways you need to move forward and try to leave certain things behind and move on with your life. And that's the best course. But in other ways, in the work that I do, you need to revisit the trauma and you need to work through it. So it's a balance between those things. I'll never say never. I think that the chance of me getting to a place where I can play the drums the way I want to is there. But right now, it's not part of my story currently.
Ryan Dusick, he's a founding member of the band Maroon 5. His new book is called Harder to Breathe. And Ryan, we really wish you all the best and it's a terrific book, and you talked a lot about vulnerability during this conversation, and it's certainly you do open up and kind of put yourself out there and talk about all the warts. So thank you so much for being on the Loadout Music Podcast. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much for having me on. It definitely was a pleasure.